I knew something was wrong the moment I pulled into my driveway and saw the row of saplings planted exactly along the fence line between my property and the common area managed by the Pinecrest Hills Homeowners Association. 6 young oak trees, each about 8 feet tall, their root balls still wrapped in burlap, positioned at perfectly measured intervals. My stomach dropped because I recognized what this was. Another power play by Sharon Pemberton, the HOA president who had made my life a living nightmare since I moved to this neighborhood in Asheville, North Carolina 3 years ago. My name is Kevin Morrison, and I'm a software developer who works from home. I bought this modest 3-bedroom ranch specifically because it backed up to HOA common land, which I thought meant privacy, and no neighbors directly behind me. What I didn't anticipate was that the HOA would treat that border like their personal kingdom, and that Sharon would decide I was public enemy number 1, because I refused to replace my mailbox with the approved model that cost $400 when my existing one was perfectly fine. I got out of my truck and walked over to inspect the trees. They were planted right on the property line according to my best guess, maybe even slightly on my side. The ground was still loose around them, the planting obviously recent. Probably happened while I was out running errands that afternoon. I pulled out my phone and took several photos from different angles, making sure to capture the positioning relative to the fence posts. My fence was a split-rail design, required by the HOA of course, and it marked the boundary between my half-acre lot and the association's land. I had paid for a survey when I bought the house, and I had the metal stakes buried at each corner of my property. The survey was precise. These trees were on or very close to my actual property line, which meant the HOA had just planted them without my permission on or directly adjacent to land I owned. I went inside and pulled up the survey documents on my computer, then went back outside with a tape measure. After 30 minutes of careful measurement from the survey stakes, I confirmed what I suspected. 4 of the 6 trees were actually on my property by 6 to 18 inches. The other 2 were right on the line itself, which meant their root systems would absolutely encroach onto my land as they grew. This was classic Sharon. She was a woman in her late 40s with an aggressive blonde bob haircut and an arsenal of rules she wielded like weapons. Every HOA meeting devolved into her lecturing homeowners about minor violations, while she and her 2 cronies on the board voted themselves more authority. I had stopped attending the meetings 6 months ago after she fined me $50 for leaving my garbage cans visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though I had been loading yard waste and the cans were out for less than an hour. I called my lawyer, David Chen, who had helped me with the house purchase. He listened to my explanation and asked me to email him the photos and survey documents. This is trespassing and potentially property damage depending on how we frame it, David said. But before we go nuclear, send the HOA a certified letter documenting what happened and demanding they remove the trees at their expense. Give them 10 days to comply. That creates a paper trail. Sharon won't remove them, I said. She'll claim they improve the property values or some garbage about the neighborhood beautification initiative. Probably, David agreed, but we need to follow the proper steps. Send the letter. If they refuse or ignore it, we file an injunction and possibly a lawsuit for trespassing and property damage. I spent the next hour drafting a formal letter. I kept the language professional but firm, stating that my survey showed 4 trees were planted on my property without permission and demanding their removal within 10 days. I cited the specific property boundaries from my survey and included copies of the relevant documentation. I printed 3 copies, signed them, and drove to the post office to send one via certified mail to the HOA's official address, which was actually just Sharon's house 6 streets over. That night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept thinking about those trees and what Sharon's end-game was. Oak trees grew large. In 20 years, they would be massive, their roots potentially damaging my fence, their branches overhanging my yard, dropping leaves and acorns everywhere. And if they were technically on my property, I would be responsible for any damage they caused, but the HOA would probably claim ownership and forbid me from trimming or removing them. The next morning, I was drinking coffee on my back deck when I noticed Sharon herself standing at the tree line, clipboard in hand, inspecting her handiwork. She was wearing her typical outfit, expensive athleisure wear that she thought made her look younger, her oversized sunglasses perched on her head. I walked down across my lawn toward her. "Sharon, we need to talk about these trees." She turned to me with a fake smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning, Kevin. Aren't they lovely?" The board approved a beautification project for this section of the common area. These oaks will provide wonderful shade and increase everyone's property values. "They're on my property," I said flatly. "4 of them are over the line, and the other 2 are right on it." "I'm sure you're mistaken," Sharon said, her voice dripping with condescension. "We had our landscaper measure everything very carefully from the fence line." "The fence line isn't the property line," I said. "I have a professional survey. Those trees need to be removed." Her expression hardened. "The HOA has every right to plant trees on common land. If you have a problem with that, you can bring it up at the next board meeting." "I'm not bringing anything to a meeting," I said, fighting to keep my voice level. "I'm sending you a certified letter demanding removal. The trees are on my property, which makes this trespassing." Sharon laughed, actually laughed. "You really want to die on this hill, Kevin? Over a few trees that will make the neighborhood more beautiful." This is exactly the kind of selfish attitude that makes HOA governance necessary. Some people only think about themselves instead of the community. "Remove the trees, Sharon." "No," she said simply. "And if you touch them, you'll be in violation of the HOA rules about destruction of common area plantings. That's a $500 fine per tree." She turned and walked away, her ponytail swishing. I stood there, fury building in my chest. This woman was unbelievable. She had trespassed on my property, planted trees without permission, and was now threatening me with fines if I removed them. 3 days later, the certified letter was delivered. I tracked it online and saw that Sharon signed for it personally. My phone rang within an hour. "Kevin Morrison," I answered. "This is Sharon Pemberton. I received your ridiculous letter." "Then you know what needs to happen," I said. "Nothing needs to happen except you need to adjust your attitude," Sharon snapped. "I had our HOA attorney review your claims, and he says the survey you're referencing is 3 years old and property lines can shift due to ground settling. The trees stay." "Property lines don't shift," I said. "That's not how surveys work. The metal stakes are still exactly where they were placed. Your attorney is wrong, or you're lying about what he said." "How dare you accuse me of lying?" "I have dedicated hundreds of hours to this community, and I won't be spoken to this way by someone who can't even follow basic mailbox regulations. Remove the trees within 10 days like my letter states, or I'm filing a lawsuit and an injunction." Sharon's voice went cold. "You do what you need to do, Kevin, so will I." She hung up. I immediately called David and told him about both conversations. "Okay, she's refusing to remove them and making threats," David said. "Let's file the injunction. I'll draft the paperwork today. We're asking the court to order removal of the trees and to prohibit the HOA from further trespassing." This will probably also open up a lawsuit for damages, though with just trees there isn't much damage yet. How long will this take? Injunctions can move pretty quickly, especially with clear property boundaries. Maybe 2 to 3 weeks for a hearing. In the meantime, document everything. If they do anything else on your property, photos and notes with dates and times. The injunction was filed 4 days later. I was served with a copy, and Sharon was served as HOA president. I wasn't there when the process server handed her the documents, but I wished I could have seen her face. What I didn't expect was the retaliation. 2 days after Sharon was served, I came home from a grocery run to find a notice taped to my front door. It was an official HOA violation notice, signed by Sharon, citing me for 13 separate infractions. My mailbox was non-compliant. My house numbers weren't the correct size according to regulations. My lawn was 1 inch too tall in the front section. My garbage cans were visible from a side angle of the street. My garden hose was stored improperly on the side of my house. The list went on, each violation carrying a $50 fine for a total of $650. I took photos of the notice, then photographed each supposed violation. My mailbox was the same one that had been there when I bought the house. My house numbers were standard 4-inch brass numbers bought at Home Depot. My lawn was perfectly maintained at 3 inches, which I could prove because I had cut it 2 days prior on my riding mower with the blade height set precisely. The garbage cans were in my side yard, barely visible from the street only if you stood at a specific angle and looked down my driveway. The garden hose was coiled on a hose holder attached to my house, which seemed like the definition of proper storage. I scanned everything and emailed it to David. His response came within an hour. This is retaliatory and we can prove it. Document everything but don't pay these fines. They'll threaten liens but we'll handle it. This actually helps our case because it shows a pattern of harassment. The next violation notice came 3 days later. This one said my deck stain was weathered and not in keeping with neighborhood standards, and demanded I restain it within 30 days or face a $200 fine. My deck was less than 2 years old, the stain still rich and even. I had done the work myself the previous spring. I took detailed photos and sent them to David. The pattern continued. Every few days, a new violation notice appeared. My doormat was the wrong color. A decorative flag in my flower bed wasn't approved. My outdoor light fixtures were too modern. Sharon was clearly trying to bury me in fines and violations, hoping I would either back down on the tree issue or just give up and move. But I'm stubborn, probably too stubborn for my own good. My father always said I was like a dog with a bone once I decided something was unfair. These trees were on my property. Sharon had no right to plant them, and I wasn't going to let her bully me into accepting it. The injunction hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after filing. David and I met at the courthouse in downtown Asheville at 8:30. Sharon arrived with a man in an expensive suit who David identified as Marcus Webb, a local attorney who apparently did a lot of HOA work. We went through security and headed to the courtroom. Judge Patricia Hendricks presided, a woman in her 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes who looked like she had seen every kind of case imaginable and wasn't impressed by any of it. David presented our case first. He laid out the survey, showed the metal stakes were still in place marking my property boundaries, displayed photos of the trees with measurements showing 4 were clearly on my property, and entered my certified letter and Sharon's refusal to remove them into evidence. "Your Honor, this is a clear case of trespassing," David said. The HOA planted trees on my client's private property without permission or notification. When notified of the error, they refused to remove them and instead began a campaign of harassment through frivolous violation notices in retaliation for this legal action. He then presented all 13 violation notices with my documentation showing they were baseless. Marcus Webb stood to present the HOA's side. Your Honor, the Pinecrest Hills HOA has a responsibility to maintain and beautify common areas for the benefit of all residents. These trees were planted in good faith on what the HOA reasonably believed to be common land. The property boundary in this area has been ambiguous for years, with the fence line serving as the de facto border. Judge Hendricks interrupted him. Counselor, there's a recorded survey showing exact property boundaries with physical markers. How is that ambiguous? Marcus cleared his throat. The survey is 3 years old, Your Honor. Ground shifts over time, and the practical usage of the boundary has been the fence line, not some theoretical pins in the ground. Surveys don't expire, Judge Hendricks said dryly, and property boundaries are legal definitions, not theories. Do you have any evidence the survey is inaccurate? We believe a new survey would show different results, Marcus said, which sounded desperate even to my untrained ear. Did you conduct a new survey? Judge Hendricks asked. Not yet, Your Honor, but we plan to. So you have no evidence, just speculation. Judge Hendricks looked at the photos and documents in front of her. And these violation notices started immediately after Mr. Morrison filed this action. Those are legitimate violations of HOA covenants, Marcus said. Judge Hendricks spent several minutes reviewing the violations and my photos. Counselor, some of these are absurd. The garden hose is stored improperly. What does that even mean? The HOA has detailed regulations about exterior storage. I'm sure you do, Judge Hendricks said. She looked at both attorneys. Here's my ruling. The survey is clear, and there's been no evidence presented that it's inaccurate. 4 trees are on Mr. Morrison's property according to that survey. The HOA will remove those 4 trees at their own expense within 14 days. The 2 trees on the actual boundary line can remain, but Mr. Morrison has the right to trim any growth that encroaches onto his property. The 13 violation notices issued after this dispute began are hereby voided, and the HOA is prohibited from issuing violation notices to Mr. Morrison without photographic evidence and specific rule citations reviewed by independent counsel to prevent further retaliation. Any violation of this order will result in contempt charges. Sharon's face went red. I could see her whispering furiously to Marcus, who was trying to calm her down. Anything else? Judge Hendricks asked. Your Honor, we'd like to file for damages and legal fees, David said. File the motion and we'll schedule another hearing, Judge Hendricks said. But I suggest the parties consider settling this. From what I can see, the HOA is clearly in the wrong here, and continuing to fight will only increase your liability. We were dismissed. Outside the courtroom, I felt like I could finally breathe. We won, I said to David. We got the injunction, he said. Now we need to make sure they comply and follow through on the damages. Sharon didn't look happy. That was an understatement. Sharon and Marcus left quickly, Sharon's heels clicking angrily on the courthouse floor. I went home feeling victorious for the first time in weeks. The judge had seen through Sharon's games and ruled clearly in my favor. 4 trees had to be removed, and I had protection from her retaliatory violations. But I should have known Sharon wouldn't let it go that easily. 14 days came and went. No trees were removed. On day 15, I took photos showing all 6 trees still standing, emailed them to David, and asked what our next step was. "I'll file a motion for contempt," David said. "This is a court order. She can't just ignore it." The contempt hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Meanwhile, I kept careful watch on my property. I even installed a trail camera facing the tree line, disguised among my own landscaping, just in case Sharon tried anything. On day 19 after the injunction, I was working in my home office when I heard the unmistakable sound of a chainsaw. I jumped up and ran to the back window. A work truck was parked on the HOA common land, and 2 men in work gear were cutting down the trees. Finally, I thought. Sharon was complying with the order, just late. I grabbed my phone and went outside to document the removal. But as I got closer, something felt wrong. The workers were cutting all 6 trees, not just the 4 on my property. They were loading the logs into their truck with an efficiency that suggested they had done this many times before. I approached them. "Hey, excuse me. Are you guys with the HOA?" The older of the 2 men, probably in his 50s with a gray beard, turned off his chainsaw. "Yep, we got hired to clear these trees out." "All of them?" I asked. "That's what the work order says. Remove 6 oak trees at this location." He showed me a printed sheet with Sharon's signature at the bottom. "Okay," I said slowly. Something still felt off, but at least the 4 trees on my property were being removed like the judge ordered. I took videos and photos of the work, making sure to document everything. The workers were fast. Within 2 hours, all 6 trees were cut down, the stumps ground down to below soil level, and the logs loaded into their truck. They cleaned up the wood chips and debris, leaving the area looking almost like the trees had never been there. After they left, I felt relieved. Sharon had finally complied, even if she was late. I emailed David to let him know the trees were removed and we could probably drop the contempt motion. 3 days later, I got a call from an unknown local number. "Is this Kevin Morrison?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, who's this?" "This is Janet Flores from the county assessor's office. I'm calling about a timber sale that was recorded last week. It lists your property address, but the seller is listed as Pinecrest Hills HOA. I'm trying to verify the ownership because our records show you own that property." My stomach dropped. "I'm sorry, what timber sale?" "The HOA filed paperwork for the sale of 6 oak trees harvested from your property address. The sale amount was $800, paid to the HOA. But if you're the property owner, you should have been the seller, not the HOA." They sold the trees. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. According to the paperwork, yes, the lumber company that purchased the wood has to file these reports with the county for tax purposes. That's how we caught the discrepancy. Those trees were on my property. The HOA planted them without permission, and a judge ordered them removed. I didn't authorize any sale. "That's what I was afraid of," Janet said. "This might be fraud or theft. The HOA claimed ownership of the trees and sold timber from your property. You should probably contact an attorney and possibly the police." I thanked her for calling and immediately phoned David. When I explained what happened, there was a long silence on the other end. "They sold your trees," David finally said. "They were ordered to remove them because they trespassed and planted them on your property, and instead of just removing them, they sold the wood and pocketed the money." "That's theft, isn't it?" "That's absolutely theft. That's also potentially fraud because they had to file paperwork claiming they owned those trees. This isn't civil court territory anymore, Kevin. This is criminal." "What do I do?" "First, get copies of all the paperwork from the county assessor. Then we're filing a police report." Sharon just committed a crime. I drove to the county assessor's office that afternoon and met with Janet Flores in person. She was a friendly woman in her 30s who seemed genuinely concerned about the situation. "This kind of thing doesn't happen often," she said, pulling up the records on her computer. "But when it does, it's usually a mess. Here's the timber sale record." She printed me copies. The paperwork showed that Pinecrest Hills HOA, represented by Sharon Pemberton as president, had sold 6 oak trees to Mountain Timber Company for $800. The trees were listed as being harvested from common area land adjacent to my address, but the legal description of the location actually matched my property boundaries. "They lied on the paperwork," I said, reading through it. "It looks that way," Janet agreed. "They described the location in a way that makes it sound like HOA land, but the coordinates they provided are actually on your lot according to our GIS system." I took the documents and drove straight to the Asheville Police Department. At the front desk, I explained that I needed to file a report for theft and fraud. The officer at the desk looked skeptical until I started explaining the details. Then he called for a detective to come talk to me. Detective Raymond Walsh met me in a small interview room. He was in his 40s, stocky with short dark hair, and he had the tired expression of someone who had seen too many stupid crimes. I laid out the whole story from the beginning. The trees being planted on my property, my demand for removal, Sharon's refusal, the injunction, the delayed removal, and now the discovery that she had sold the wood for $800. Detective Walsh took notes and examined the documents I provided. "So let me make sure I understand. The court ordered the HOA to remove these trees because they were on your property. Instead of just removing them, the HOA president filed paperwork claiming the trees were on HOA land, sold them to a lumber company, and kept the money." "That's exactly what happened," I said. "And you have the court order, the timber sale records, and your property survey all showing this?" "Yes, all of it." Detective Walsh leaned back in his chair. "This is pretty straightforward then. She stole trees from your property and sold them. That's theft. The fact that she filed false paperwork with the county to do it adds fraud. How much did you say the sale was for?" $800. In North Carolina, theft over $1,000 is a felony, but $800 is still a Class 1 misdemeanor. The fraud element might bump it up depending on how the DA wants to charge it. He looked at me. "Are you willing to press charges?" "Absolutely," I said without hesitation. "Okay, I'll need to get statements from the county assessor, the lumber company, and probably your attorney. We'll also need to interview Sharon Pemberton. This might take a few weeks to put together, but based on what you're showing me, there's definitely probable cause for charges." I left the police station feeling a strange mix of vindication and disbelief. Sharon had been such a nightmare about every tiny rule, and now she was facing criminal charges for stealing trees from my property. David was thrilled when I called him with the update. "This is perfect. We're also going to file a civil suit for damages, attorney fees, and the value of the trees. Even though they were young trees, oak timber has value and she stole from you." Over the next 3 weeks, Detective Walsh did his investigation. He interviewed Janet Flores, got statements from Mountain Timber Company confirming they paid the HOA $800 for the wood, and obtained all the HOA financial records showing where that money went. It turned out Sharon had deposited the $800 into the HOA general fund and used it to pay for new landscaping at the neighborhood entrance. Detective Walsh also interviewed the workers who cut down the trees. They confirmed that Sharon had hired them, provided the work order, and told them to bring the logs to Mountain Timber Company for sale. The workers had no idea there was a property dispute and thought they were just doing a job for the HOA. Then came the interview with Sharon herself. I wasn't present for it, but Detective Walsh told me later that she had been defiant, claiming the HOA had every right to remove trees from common areas and sell the timber to recover costs. When confronted with the court order and property survey, she argued that the trees became HOA property the moment they were planted, regardless of where the property line was. She really doesn't think she did anything wrong, Detective Walsh told me during a follow-up meeting. That's going to be a problem for her in court, but it makes my job easier. No remorse, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just entitlement. The charges were filed in early August. Sharon Pemberton was charged with 1 count of misdemeanor theft by taking and 1 count of filing a false instrument, which is a type of fraud in North Carolina. She was arrested at her home, processed, and released on her own recognizance with a court date set for September. The neighborhood exploded with gossip. I started getting calls and visits from other homeowners who had been on the receiving end of Sharon's enforcement campaigns. One neighbor, Tom Jenkins, told me she had fined him $300 for painting his house a shade of beige that was 2 tones off from the approved color palette. Another neighbor, Lisa Wu, said Sharon had tried to foreclose on her house over unpaid fines for having the wrong style of porch railing. Everyone's been terrified of her, Tom said when he stopped by one evening. She runs the HOA like a dictator. The board meetings are a joke because her 2 friends on the board vote however she tells them to. We've all been hoping someone would stand up to her. I didn't really have a choice, I said. She planted trees on my property. Most people would have just let it go to avoid the hassle, Tom said. I'm glad you didn't. Word spread that Sharon was facing criminal charges. An emergency HOA board meeting was called, and 2 of the 5 board members, including one of Sharon's loyal supporters, resigned immediately. The remaining 3, including Sharon, tried to maintain control, but homeowners started showing up to meetings demanding answers. I attended the meeting in late August, my first one in almost a year. The community center meeting room was packed with at least 50 homeowners, far more than the usual attendance of 10 or 12. Sharon sat at the front table, looking furious but trying to maintain her composure. She called the meeting to order and tried to launch into standard business, but she was immediately interrupted. We're not doing regular business until we address the criminal charges, Tom Jenkins said, standing up. You're facing theft charges for stealing from a homeowner. You need to resign. I did no such thing, Sharon snapped. I removed trees from HOA common land in accordance with my duties as president. The legal system is being manipulated by a vindictive homeowner who has consistently refused to follow community rules. The court said the trees were on his property, someone else called out. You ignored a court order. The court was wrong, Sharon said, her voice rising. Property boundaries are complicated, and the HOA has a right to manage the land we maintain. You sold timber that wasn't yours and kept the money, Lisa Wu said. That's theft. The meeting devolved into chaos, with homeowners shouting questions and demands for Sharon's resignation. She refused, banging a gavel and threatening to fine people for disrupting official HOA business. Eventually, she just stormed out, leaving everyone in confusion. 2 days later, the remaining board members who weren't Sharon announced they were calling for a special election to recall Sharon and elect new board leadership. The HOA bylaws allowed for recall elections if 20% of homeowners signed a petition. The petition was circulated and had 40% of homeowners signed within a week. Sharon tried to fight the recall, claiming the petition was invalid for various procedural reasons, but the HOA's attorney, who apparently had been kept in the dark about most of Sharon's antics, told the board that the recall was legitimate and had to proceed. The recall election was held in mid-September, just a week before Sharon's criminal trial. The vote was overwhelming. Sharon was removed from the board by an 87% vote, and 3 new board members were elected, including Tom Jenkins and Lisa Wu. The new board's first action was to hire a new HOA management company to review all fines and violations issued in the past 2 years. They found hundreds of questionable fines, many of them targeting homeowners who had questioned Sharon's authority. The board voted to void most of them and refund money where possible. They also issued a formal apology to me and offered to pay my legal fees as a settlement. David negotiated a payment of $15,000 to cover his fees and compensate me for the hassle, stress, and the value of the timber that was stolen. The new board agreed immediately, apparently horrified by what Sharon had done and eager to make it right. Sharon's criminal trial was held on September 23rd. David and I attended as witnesses. Sharon showed up with Marcus Webb as her attorney, but he looked uncomfortable, like he knew this was a lost cause. The prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Amanda Rivera, laid out the case methodically. She presented the survey showing the trees were on my property, the court order requiring their removal, the timber sale documents showing Sharon had claimed ownership and sold the wood, and testimony from Mountain Timber Company about the payment. Janet Flores testified about how the paperwork had falsely represented the location as HOA land. Detective Walsh testified about his investigation, and Sharon's statements denying any wrongdoing. I testified about the entire timeline, from discovering the trees to the court battle to finding out about the sale. David testified as my attorney about the legal proceedings. Marcus Webb tried to argue that Sharon had acted in good faith, believing the trees were HOA property, and that she was just trying to recover costs for the removal. But the prosecutor demolished that argument by pointing out that a judge had explicitly ruled the trees were on my property, which Sharon knew before she had them removed and sold. The judge, a different one from our injunction hearing, was not sympathetic. Miss Pemberton, you had a court order telling you these trees were not on HOA property. You chose to remove them anyway and then profit from that removal by selling the timber. That's theft, plain and simple. The fact that you used your position as HOA president to do it makes it worse, not better. Sharon was found guilty on both counts. For the misdemeanor theft charge, she was sentenced to 60 days in jail, suspended to probation, and 100 hours of community service. For the false instrument charge, she received a fine of $2,000. She was also ordered to pay restitution of $800 to me for the value of the timber, plus court costs. Sharon's face went pale when the sentence was read. She tried to say something, but Marcus pulled her back down into her seat. They left the courtroom quickly after the judge dismissed us. Outside the courthouse, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. "It's finally over," I said to David. "Almost," he said. "She still has to pay the restitution and complete her sentence. But yeah, it's essentially over." You won. The $800 restitution check arrived 3 weeks later, sent from Sharon's personal account with a money order. No note, no apology, just the payment. I deposited it and used it to buy a new grill for my deck, which felt appropriately ironic given all of Sharon's complaints about my deck staining. The HOA stabilized under new leadership. Tom Jenkins became the new president, and he was reasonable and communicative. They revised the violation process to require photographic evidence and warnings before fines, and they stopped the aggressive enforcement campaigns that Sharon had loved. I even got involved myself, joining the Architectural Review Committee to help review requests for home modifications. Turned out that when the HOA wasn't run by a tyrant, it could actually be helpful for maintaining property values without making everyone's lives miserable. Sharon moved out of the neighborhood 6 months after her conviction. I heard through the gossip chain that she couldn't handle living there after being recalled and convicted. She sold her house and moved somewhere in South Carolina. I didn't keep track beyond that. She was someone else's problem now. The 2 oak trees that had been on the actual property line were gone with the other 4, which was fine with me. The new board offered to plant new trees on the common land, well back from the property line, but I told them I was perfectly happy with the open space. I could see the sunset better without the trees anyway. My property line stayed clear after that. The new board made sure to notify me before doing any work near my lot, and they always asked permission if they needed to access my land for any reason. It was a refreshing change. Looking back on the whole insane situation, I still couldn't quite believe it had happened. Sharon had planted trees on my property, refused to remove them when ordered by a court, cut them down and sold them for $800, and then acted like she was the victim when she got arrested for it. The level of entitlement was staggering. But it taught me something important about standing up to bullies, even bureaucratic ones in positions of petty power. If I had just let the trees go, Sharon would have kept escalating. She would have kept finding new violations, kept pushing boundaries, kept making my life difficult because I had dared to question her authority over a mailbox. Instead, by pushing back and refusing to accept her illegal behavior, I not only protected my own property rights, but freed an entire neighborhood from a toxic HOA president. Other homeowners thanked me for months afterward, telling me stories about fines that were voided and harassment that stopped once Sharon was removed. The experience also taught me about the importance of documentation. Every photo I took, every measurement I recorded, every certified letter I sent, all of it mattered when it came time to prove my case in court. If I had just complained without evidence, Sharon probably would have gotten away with it. I kept the court order framed in my home office as a reminder. Not of the conflict, but of the resolution. Sometimes standing up for what's right means going through courts and lawyers and uncomfortable confrontations. But it's worth it when the alternative is letting someone abuse their power unchecked. The neighborhood became a genuinely nice place to live after Sharon left. Block parties started happening again. People actually talked to each other without fear of being reported for violations. The HOA focused on real issues like maintaining common areas and organizing community events, rather than measuring grass height with rulers and issuing fines for unauthorized doormats. I stayed in that house for several more years. Every time I looked at my backyard and the clear tree line beyond it, I remembered the saga and felt satisfied with how it ended. Sharon had tried to bully me into submission with her trees and her fines and her power trips. Instead, she ended up with a criminal record, a recall, and restitution paid to the person she tried to push around. Justice isn't always fast, and it isn't always clean, but sometimes it works exactly the way it's supposed to. Sharon Pemberton planted trees on my property line, cut them down, and sold the wood for $800. She thought she could get away with it because she was the HOA president, and I was just one homeowner who wouldn't fight back. She was wrong. The $800 I received in restitution sat in my account for a while before I spent it. That money represented more than the timber value. It represented proof that even small acts of theft and fraud have consequences. It represented the principle that property rights matter, even when someone with perceived authority tries to violate them. I thought about all the homeowners who had suffered under Sharon's reign. The unnecessary fines, the arbitrary rule enforcement, the constant stress of wondering what violation notice would show up next. All of that ended because she got too greedy and too confident. She could have just removed the trees quietly when the judge ordered it. Instead, she saw an opportunity to make money and took it, never imagining that the county would catch the discrepancy or that I would press criminal charges. Her downfall was her own arrogance, her absolute certainty that she was untouchable as HOA president. She had gotten away with so much for so long that she stopped believing rules applied to her. The irony was delicious. A woman who had spent years enforcing every tiny regulation on everyone else ended up convicted of breaking the law herself. The community healed slowly after her departure. The new board worked hard to rebuild trust, and they succeeded. The HOA became what it was supposed to be, an organization that maintained common spaces and protected property values without micromanaging everyone's lives. Tom Jenkins told me once over beers at a neighborhood barbecue that my fight with Sharon had been a turning point. People were ready to just dissolve the whole HOA, he said. Everyone was so fed up, but you showed us that the problem wasn't the concept of an HOA, it was Sharon. Once she was gone, we could actually make it work the right way. I appreciated that perspective. HOAs get a bad reputation, often deservedly, but they don't have to be nightmares. With the right leadership and reasonable rules fairly enforced, they can be beneficial. The key is accountability, something Sharon had avoided for years until she finally crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. The criminal charges were that line. Civil court disputes can drag on forever and get muddled in technicalities. But theft is theft, and fraud is fraud. When Sharon sold those trees, she committed crimes that were clear-cut enough for even her expensive attorney to not be able to defend effectively. Detective Walsh called me a few months after the trial to check in. "I wanted to let you know that Pemberton completed her community service," he said. She spent her 100 hours cleaning up litter along the highway. Apparently, she complained the entire time about the orange vest not being flattering. I laughed at that image. Sharon in an orange safety vest picking up trash along the roadside, probably fuming about the indignity of it all. It was a fitting end to her story. "Thanks for letting me know," I said, "and thanks for taking the case seriously. I know $800 isn't a huge amount in the grand scheme of things." "It's not about the amount," Detective Walsh said. "It's about people thinking they can abuse positions of power. We see it with HOAs, small business owners, local officials, all kinds of petty tyrants who think they are above the law. Everyone we catch and charge sends a message that they're not." That message resonated through our neighborhood and apparently beyond. I heard from David that several other HOAs in the area reviewed their enforcement procedures and made changes after Sharon's case became public. Nobody wanted to be the next HOA president facing criminal charges because they got too aggressive with their authority. The 2 remaining trees that had been right on the property line were gone, leaving my backyard feeling more open than ever. I planted some native shrubs along my side of the fence line, creating a natural border that looked nice without the imposing presence of 6 oak trees. The shrubs attracted birds and butterflies, making my morning coffee on the deck even more enjoyable. Life returned to normal, or rather, it became normal for the first time since I moved in. I could work from home without constantly watching for violation notices. I could maintain my property the way I wanted within reason. I could be part of a community instead of feeling like a target. The whole experience taught me valuable lessons about documentation, persistence, and the importance of standing up for your rights even when it's difficult and expensive and stressful. It would have been easier to just let Sharon have her way with the trees. It would have been simpler to pay the bogus fines and comply with the unreasonable demands. But easier and simpler aren't always right. Those trees were planted on my property without permission. Sharon's response to being called out was to double down and then commit theft. Every step of the way, she chose to escalate rather than admit she was wrong. The justice system worked slowly but effectively. The civil injunction established the facts and gave Sharon a chance to comply. When she defied the court order and committed theft, the criminal system held her accountable. The HOA recall process allowed the community to remove her from power. Each system played its role in resolving the situation. I kept all the documents from the case in a file box in my office closet. The survey, the letters, the court orders, the timber sale records, everything. I didn't look at them often, but I knew they were there. Physical proof that standing up to a bully, even one armed with HOA bylaws and a clipboard, was possible and worthwhile. Years later, when I eventually sold that house and moved to a different state for a job opportunity, I took that file box with me. The new owners were a young couple who seemed nervous about the HOA during the home inspection. I sat down with them and told them the whole story, showed them the documents, and explained how the HOA had changed. "It's actually a good HOA now," I assured them. "Tom Jenkins is still president and they're reasonable people, but if they ever stop being reasonable, you have rights. Property owners have rights. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The couple seemed reassured. They bought the house, and from what I heard later, they were happy there. The HOA remained stable and functional, a far cry from the Sharon Pemberton days. As for Sharon herself, I never saw or heard from her again after she moved away. I sometimes wondered if she learned anything from the experience, if she reflected on how her actions had led to criminal conviction and community disgrace. Probably not. People like Sharon rarely have that kind of self-awareness. But it didn't matter what Sharon thought or felt. What mattered was that justice had been served, a community had been freed from a tyrant, and the principle that property rights trump HOA overreach had been firmly established. The story of the trees became neighborhood legend. New residents would hear about it and ask me for details. I always obliged, not because I enjoyed reliving the stress, but because it was important for people to know that fighting back against HOA abuse was possible. In the end, Sharon Pemberton planted trees on my property line thinking she could assert HOA dominance over a homeowner who had dared to defy her mailbox rules. She cut them down and sold the wood for $800, thinking she could profit from her trespass. Instead, she got a criminal record, lost her position, and had to pay restitution while performing community service in an orange vest. The scales balanced. The trees were gone, my property line was clear, and the neighborhood was better for the whole experience. Sometimes stories have endings that feel satisfying not because they're happy, but because they're just. This was one of those stories. I learned to be more careful about HOAs after that, always researching the board and their reputation before buying in a neighborhood with one. But I also learned that HOAs themselves aren't the enemy. Bad leadership is the enemy, and bad leadership can be removed through the proper channels if you're willing to fight for it. The $800 restitution eventually went toward a really nice grill that I used for neighborhood barbecues. Every burger I flipped on that grill felt like a small victory, purchased with money Sharon had tried to steal but was forced to pay back. It was petty satisfaction, but I enjoyed it nonetheless. My lawyer David and I stayed in touch even after I moved away. He told me the case became something of a teaching moment in local legal circles, an example of how civil and criminal law can intersect in property disputes. He used it as a case study when speaking to other attorneys about HOA litigation. Most HOA cases never get to criminal charges, he explained. They stay in civil court because it's usually just disputes over rules and fines. But when an HOA actually commits theft or fraud, it opens up a whole different avenue for accountability. Your case proved that. I was glad my misery had at least served some educational purpose. If other attorneys learned from my situation and helped their clients hold abusive HOAs accountable, then the stress and expense had been worth it beyond just my personal vindication. The experience changed how I viewed property ownership and community governance. I became more engaged, more aware of my rights, and more willing to push back against unreasonable authority. Those are lessons that served me well in other areas of life too. Looking back years later from my new home in a non-HOA neighborhood, I could appreciate the whole saga for what it was. A story about standing up to a bully, about property rights, about the importance of documentation and legal processes, and ultimately about justice prevailing even when it takes time and effort. Sharon Pemberton planted trees on my property line, cut them down, and sold the wood for $800. She thought she had won. But in the end, she lost everything: her HOA presidency, her reputation, her clean record, and $800 plus court costs and fines. Meanwhile, I kept my property rights, gained the respect of my neighbors, and helped reform an entire HOA. That's how the story ends. Not with the trees still standing as a monument to HOA overreach, but with them gone, with justice served, and with a community better off for having gone through the struggle. Sometimes the right ending isn't the easy one, but it's the one worth fighting for.